Thanksgiving had always been her holiday, the day she poured her heart into every dish, every decoration, every small detail that made family feel like home. Even as cancer weakened her body, she refused to let the tradition slip away. She postponed her final chemotherapy session against her doctor's advice, just to make sure everything was perfect. The turkey was basted, the pies were cooling, and the table was set with trembling, loving hands. But when the day came, the door never opened. The house remained silent except for the soft ticking of the clock. They celebrated elsewhere, without her, without a second thought. Yet in that crushing silence, she found something she hadn't expected, the strength to stop waiting for their gratitude and start living for her own peace. Sometimes the deepest betrayals light the path toward the greatest self-respect. Have you ever sacrificed everything for your family, only to be forgotten when it mattered most? Share your story below, and subscribe for more powerful journeys of silent resilience, dignity, and rebirth. In the small town where everyone knew each other's names and every Thanksgiving felt like a homecoming, she had always been the center of gravity. Her name was Margaret, though most called her Maggie, and for as long as anyone could remember, she had been the quiet architect of every family gathering. She wasn't loud or flashy. She didn't command attention when she walked into a room. Her power was subtler, stitched into the fresh rolls that warmed the kitchen counters, the hand-stitched place cards that marked each family member's seat, the tender way she made sure everyone's favorite dish appeared on the table without them ever needing to ask. Maggie's house wasn't the biggest or the fanciest, but it was the one everyone came back to, year after year. Even when life started to chip away at her, when her husband passed quietly in his sleep, one bitter January morning, when the arthritis began gnawing at her hands, when her body grew slower and more tired, Maggie never wavered. Thanksgiving was her sacred promise, a way to stitch her family together even as life pulled at the seams. This year, though, life had thrown a heavier stone in her path. The diagnosis had come in early spring, wrapped in the sterile detachment of a doctor's voice too practiced at delivering bad news. Cancer. Aggressive, but treatable, if she fought hard and stayed the course. And Maggie, being Maggie, took it all in with the same quiet grace she brought to everything else. She nodded, asked the right questions, thanked the doctor, and began the grueling march through chemotherapy. Her hair thinned, her hands trembled, her appetite disappeared, but still she planned. Still she cooked. Still she insisted that this Thanksgiving would happen no matter how much of her strength it cost. When her oncologist recommended pushing up her final chemotherapy session to ensure she completed treatment before the holiday, Maggie hesitated. She understood the stakes. She understood the risks. But she also knew that if she shifted her schedule, if she allowed the cancer to dictate one more part of her life, she might lose the last thing that made her feel like herself. She needed Thanksgiving. She needed the laughter, the clatter of silverware, the murmur of family stories retold. She needed it to remind her, and everyone else, that she was still here, still fighting, still holding them all together. So, she chose. She postponed her final session. She bundled herself in layers against the early chill of November, drove herself to the grocery store, and spent days slowly, painfully assembling everything. The turkey was seasoned and resting in the fridge. The pies, apple, pumpkin, and pecan, lined the counter, their scents filling the house with a sweetness that masked the metallic tang of medicine still lingering in her nose. She polished the silver, ironed the tablecloth, set out the good china, every movement a prayer, every detail a plea. Remember me, see me, come home to me. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned bright and clear. Maggie rose early, her body aching in ways she had learned to quietly endure, and slipped into the kitchen to preheat the oven. She wore her best sweater, the one with the delicate embroidery her husband had always admired. She even put on a little lipstick, though her hands shook as she applied it. Everything was ready. Everything was waiting. She watched the clock, her heart lifting slightly at every passing car that slowed on the street. She adjusted the centerpiece on the table, straightened the napkins, stirred the gravy one more time. Noon came and went. Then 1 o'clock. Then 2. She checked her phone, certain she must have missed a call, a message, a reason. But there was nothing. Only silence. Only the ticking of the old kitchen clock and the gentle whine of the wind against the window panes. By 3 o'clock, Maggie sat down at the head of the table, hands folded neatly in her lap, staring at the places she had set with such care. She waited as the daylight faded and the house grew colder. She waited until it became undeniable that no one was coming. They had celebrated somewhere else, without her, without even telling her. Maybe at her daughter's house across town, maybe at a cousin's larger home out in the country. It didn't matter where. What mattered was that they had chosen convenience over her. They had chosen ease over the woman who had spent her whole life making things easy for them. For a long time, she didn't move. She just sat there, surrounded by the echoes of a family that had forgotten the hands that had built every memory they cherished. She sat there with the turkey cooling in the oven, the pies untouched, the candles burning low. She sat there and let herself feel every jagged shard of that betrayal, not with screams or accusations, but with the quiet, devastating heartbreak of someone who finally saw the truth she had spent years trying not to see. But somewhere in the deep stillness of that moment, Maggie found something else too. A small, fierce ember of resolve buried under years of selfless giving. She realized that she didn't need to prove her worth through casseroles and table settings and endless forgiveness. She didn't need to earn a place at a table she had built with her own hands. She was enough. She had always been enough. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop waiting for them to come home and start building a new home for herself. The days after Thanksgiving passed in a haze of silence. The leftovers went untouched, the once vibrant house growing colder with each setting sun. Maggie moved slowly, carefully packing away the good china, folding the linens she had so painstakingly ironed, scraping untouched gravy into the trash with hands that still ached from the effort. There were no apologies waiting on her phone, no hurried explanations, no car pulling into the driveway with a sheepish daughter or contrite grandchild. They had simply moved on. They had celebrated without her, and now they continued their lives, without so much as a backward glance. Maggie could have called. She could have demanded answers, voiced her hurt, begged for the kind of recognition she had spent a lifetime quietly earning. But something inside her had shifted too deeply. She was tired of waiting for them to see her, tired of measuring her worth by the crumbs of attention they occasionally tossed her way, tired of sacrificing parts of herself in hopes of being remembered. For once, she let the silence stand. Instead, she turned inward. She sat by the window each afternoon, bundled in a warm quilt, watching the world move on outside. She watched leaves swirl down empty streets, children pulling sleds through the first dustings of snow, couples hurrying past, their arms full of holiday packages. And slowly, Maggie began to imagine a different kind of life, one that wasn't built around being needed, but around simply being. It started small. She ordered a stack of library books, titles she had always meant to read but never had the time for. She signed up for a pottery class at the community center, even though her hands trembled and her joints protested. She planted paper white bulbs in the windowsill, watching them grow taller each day, tiny white blooms reaching for the pale winter sun. Maggie had spent so long tending to the lives of others that tending to her own felt foreign, almost rebellious. But with every small act of care she gave herself, the old wounds stitched themselves a little tighter. She began to see herself not just as the backdrop to everyone else's celebrations, but as the main character of her own life. Her health, too, demanded her attention. Postponing her final chemotherapy session had been a gamble, one she couldn't ignore any longer. With quiet determination, Maggie picked up the phone and called her oncologist, scheduling the treatment she had delayed. She knew it would be hard. She knew it would drain what little strength she had left. But she also knew she deserved a chance at more life, a life that belonged to her. The day of her rescheduled appointment dawned gray and bitterly cold. Maggie wrapped herself in her thickest sweater, pulled a hat low over her thinning hair, and drove herself to the hospital. She checked in at the front desk, the antiseptic scent of the clinic filling her nostrils, and waited patiently among strangers whose eyes mirrored her own quiet resignation. When her name was called, she rose with steady grace and followed the nurse into the treatment room. As the IV dripped slowly into her veins, Maggie closed her eyes and thought not of the family who had forgotten her, but of the life she was choosing for herself. She thought of springtime hikes she might take, of concerts she might attend, of afternoons spent in sunlit cafes with a good book and a strong cup of coffee. She thought of the dinners she might host, not grand productions demanding endless labor, but simple, joyful gatherings with people who chose to be there, who valued her company without needing anything more from her. The treatment was grueling. By the time Maggie returned home, her body was trembling with exhaustion, her skin clammy and pale. But even in her weakness, she felt stronger than she had in months. She had chosen herself. She had chosen to fight for her own future, even when others had shown they wouldn't fight for her. And that was a victory no one could take away. The days of December grew shorter and colder, but Maggie's spirit grew lighter. She decorated her small tree with simple white lights and hand-painted ornaments she made in her pottery class. She baked a single batch of cookies, not for a crowd, but for herself and a few close neighbors who had quietly stepped into the spaces her family had abandoned. She lit candles in the windows each night, not as a beacon for those who had left, but as a celebration of her own enduring light. For the first time in a long time, Maggie wasn't living her life in hopes of being seen. She wasn't cooking. Meals no one would come to eat. Setting tables no one would gather around. She was living for the sheer, beautiful, defiant joy of being alive. And somewhere in the deep, quiet center of herself, Maggie knew she hadn't missed Thanksgiving. She had simply been waiting for the right celebration to begin, the one where she was finally, blessedly, the guest of honor in her own life. As Christmas lights began to twinkle on rooftops and holiday songs drifted from every shop window, Maggie noticed a strange sensation growing inside her. Not bitterness, not anger, but a hollow ache that deepened with each passing day. She was building a life for herself, yes. She was healing, slowly, but the wound left by her family's absence was not so easily soothed by pottery classes and paper white flowers. It flared up when she passed the bakery window, seeing trays of festive cookies she once would have bought for her grandchildren. It ached when she watched families gather their Christmas trees, bundling them onto the roofs of their cars with laughter she could almost hear through the glass. It gnawed at her in the quiet hours after the sun went down, when her house filled with a silence that even music couldn't quite chase away. Still, Maggie refused to reach out. She refused to be the one who called, who apologized for feeling hurt, who chased after the crumbs of affection they had carelessly dropped. She had chosen her dignity over their thoughtless comfort, and she would not betray herself now. And yet, the silence from her family became its own kind of message. They weren't just waiting for her to get over it. They were pretending it had never happened. Not a word about Thanksgiving. Not a sheepish invitation to a holiday dinner. Not even a card in the mail. It was as if, having failed her once, they had simply decided it was easier to erase her rather than confront their own guilt. The realization stung more deeply than she expected. She had always believed, perhaps naively, that family ties could stretch and strain, but never truly break. Now she saw the truth with painful clarity. Love, even familial love, could be neglected. Until it withered away. And Maggie, in choosing herself, had forced them to confront a version of her they didn't know how to handle, a woman who would not silently absorb their neglect anymore. The days grew colder. The snow piled against the sides of her little house. Maggie bundled herself tightly against the winter winds and kept moving, one small act of self-preservation at a time. She finished her pottery course and proudly brought home her misshapen bowls and vases, displaying them on the mantel like trophies of a battle no one else had seen. She attended a Christmas Eve service at the old church downtown, where she sat among strangers and let the hymns wash over her, finding comfort in the simple act of being part of something, even if it wasn't the family she had once imagined. It was after that service, walking home alone under a sky so clear it seemed dusted with diamonds, that Maggie made a decision. She would not mourn people who had chosen not to show up. She would not spend another holiday setting places for those who couldn't bother to remember her existence. She would create new traditions, not out of spite, but out of love for the woman she was becoming, a woman who deserved to be celebrated, even if she had to celebrate herself. On New Year's Eve, Maggie invited 2 of her neighbors, widows, she had come to know through her pottery class, over for a simple supper. They wore colorful paper crowns from a novelty store, drank sparkling cider from mismatched glasses, and laughed over stories from long ago. There were no grand declarations, no fireworks, just the steady, healing hum of companionship built on mutual respect and chosen kindness. When midnight came, they toasted to themselves, to surviving, to living lives that still mattered even when the world wasn't watching. In the weeks that followed, Maggie found a rhythm that no longer revolved around what she had lost. She volunteered at the local library, reading to children whose bright, curious eyes reminded her that giving didn't have to mean being taken for granted. She began taking long walks every morning, regardless of the weather, feeling the strength slowly return to her body, the breath filling her lungs with a freshness she hadn't felt in years. She even traveled a little, nothing extravagant, just small bus trips to nearby towns, museums, historical sites she had always meant to visit. She marveled at how wide the world still was, how much life still waited for her beyond the narrow walls of the life she had once lived. And through it all, Maggie allowed herself to grieve, not just for the family gatherings missed, but for the years she had spent giving more than she received, believing that love required her silence, her sacrifices, her invisibility. She grieved, the version of herself who had measured her worth in casseroles baked and tables set, who had waited year after year for recognition that never came. And then slowly, she let that grief go. It didn't happen all at once. Healing never does. Some days she still woke up with a lump in her throat, a phantom ache for a family she wished had been different. Some days she still reached instinctively for her phone to call, to fix, to bridge the gap they had created. But more and more, those days were outweighed by the ones where she woke up smiling, where her first thought was not of who had left her behind, but of what adventure, however small, she might create for herself today. Maggie had not simply survived the betrayal that Thanksgiving brought. She had transcended it, turning her heartbreak into the foundation of a new, fuller life. She had learned, finally, that sometimes the greatest act of love you can offer the world is the decision to love yourself enough to walk away from what no longer feeds your soul. Maggie's transformation was not loud or sudden. It unfolded like the slow blooming of a flower after a long, bitter winter, almost invisible to the casual observer, but undeniable to those who paid close enough attention. Inside her, the emotional landscape shifted from barren fields of sadness to rich green spaces of resilience. She had learned, perhaps the hardest way, that grief isn't always about losing someone to death. Sometimes it's about losing the illusion you clung to so tightly, the illusion that love was guaranteed simply because blood said it should be. That was the wound Maggie tended to now, with the same patience and tenderness she had once reserved for others. In the quiet moments, sipping tea by the window, tying a scarf around her neck before a morning walk, Maggie often found herself reflecting on the deeper truths her loneliness had revealed. She thought about how she had lived her entire adult life, giving, giving, and giving, believing that love was transactional, that loyalty could be bought with enough sacrifices, enough perfect Thanksgivings, enough invisible bending to fit the needs of others. She realized now that love built on expectation, love that demands silent compliance, isn't love at all. It's obligation dressed up as affection. There were nights when that realization brought fresh waves of pain. Nights when she remembered birthdays where she cooked and cleaned while everyone else celebrated. Holidays when she set the stage so perfectly only to stand in the wings, unacknowledged. Phone calls that never came unless someone needed something. It wasn't that her family didn't care in some small way. It was that they didn't see her. Not really. They saw what she did for them. They saw the comfort she provided. They saw the ease of her presence. But they didn't see the woman behind it all, the woman who had dreams, weariness, sadness, hope. And when someone does not truly see you, they cannot truly love you. Accepting that truth hurt more than any physical pain Maggie had endured, even more than the poison of chemotherapy in her veins. But accepting it also set her free. For the first time, she no longer chased the mirage of approval, no longer waited by the phone for a scrap of acknowledgement. She understood now that her worth was not determined by her usefulness to others. Her existence was not validated by their convenience. She was enough, just by being. As winter melted into early spring, Maggie found herself shedding old habits the way the trees shed their brittle leaves. She stopped sending the first message, stopped being the one to organize gatherings that only she seemed to cherish. She stopped overextending herself in hopes of earning a place at tables that never truly welcomed her presence. In the space, those habits left behind, she planted new rituals, quiet, beautiful, sacred to her alone. She created Sunday mornings where she lingered over coffee and poetry, the sunlight pouring in through the kitchen windows, painting gold on her worn wooden table. She explored nearby towns on spontaneous drives, savoring the feeling of being guided not by duty, but by curiosity. She treated herself to flowers every week at the market, not waiting for anyone else to think her worthy of such beauty. Small things, perhaps, invisible things to anyone but her. But they were acts of reclamation, each one a whispered reminder. I am alive. I am enough. And perhaps the most profound change of all was this. Maggie learned to forgive, not for them, but for herself. She forgave them for their thoughtlessness, their blindness, their inability to meet her where she needed to be met. She forgave them for the birthdays missed, the Thanksgivings abandoned, the silence that spoke louder than any cruel word could. She forgave them because carrying the weight of that hurt only tethered her to a past that no longer deserved her energy. Forgiveness did not mean she invited them back into her life in the same way. It did not mean she forgot the lessons she had paid so dearly to learn. It simply meant she no longer allowed the pain to define her days. The lightness that forgiveness brought was unlike anything Maggie had ever felt before. It wasn't the bright, giddy lightness of a child or the fierce euphoria of revenge. It was the steady, warm glow of someone who has laid down a heavy burden after carrying it too long. It was a lightness that made room for laughter again, even if it was laughter shared mostly with herself. It was a lightness that made solitude feel like sanctuary instead of punishment. There were still moments when the past tugged at her heart. A recipe clipped from a magazine she once meant to share with her daughter. A handmade ornament gifted to her by a grandchild years ago. In those moments, Maggie allowed herself to feel the sadness, but she did not drown in it. She let it wash over her and then recede, like the tide, leaving her standing firm on the shore of her own hard-won peace. Maggie was not the same woman who had postponed her final chemotherapy session to set a perfect Thanksgiving table. That woman had lived her life, hoping to be chosen. The woman Maggie had become chose herself every single day. And in that choosing, she had discovered a truth more nourishing, more lasting than any family gathering. Home is not a place other people build for you. It is the life you build for yourself, brick by quiet, steady brick. Spring unfurled slowly, like a patient apology after a long, bitter silence. The daffodils were the first to arrive, bright and defiant against the lingering frost, and Maggie found herself smiling every time she passed a patch of their golden heads bobbing in the breeze. Something about their stubborn brightness, their refusal to wait for perfect conditions to bloom, resonated with her spirit. She, too, had decided not to wait anymore, not for better timing, not for someone else's approval, not for the perfect invitation that would never come. The first real warmth of the season fell on a Saturday morning, and Maggie, after years of saying, maybe next year, decided it was time to plant a garden. She drove herself to the local nursery, her battered old sedan creaking along the gravel lot, and wandered through rows of seedlings and saplings, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and new beginnings. Her body moved slower now, her joints stiff and sore from treatment and time, but there was a quiet fire inside her that pushed her forward. She chose flowers first, marigolds, petunias, snapdragons in every color she could find, then herbs, basil, rosemary, lavender. She selected tomato plants, too, though she laughed aloud at the thought of herself bending over in the summer heat to tend them. No matter. The vision was what mattered, a patch of living color outside her little kitchen window, a daily reminder that life, no matter how battered, always insists on finding a way. Back home, Maggie dug into the soil with shaking hands and a fierce kind of tenderness. She knelt carefully, spacing each plant with deliberate attention, feeling the sun on her back, the cool crumble of dirt beneath her fingers. The ache in her knees and shoulders felt different from the pain she had carried all winter. It was earned, purposeful, almost sweet. As she worked, neighbors passed by on their walks, some waving, some stopping to chat. One of her pottery friends dropped off a basket of scones and stayed for a while, helping Maggie stake the tomato plants, laughing when they both realized they had no idea what they were doing. It didn't matter. Perfection was no longer the goal. The joy was in the trying, the planting, the hoping. Later, sitting on her porch with dirt still clinging to her palms and the smell of crushed basil rising from the garden bed, Maggie felt a kind of peace settle over her that she hadn't known she was missing. It was the peace of building something for herself, of growing a life rooted in her own choices rather than waiting for someone else to give her permission. There were still gaps, of course, still moments when she missed the chaos of a house full of family, the deep, sweet noise of people she loved gathered under one roof. There were still pangs when she saw families bustling together at the market, children tugging on grandmother's sleeves, husbands carrying heavy baskets while wives pointed at ripe strawberries. But those pangs didn't undo her anymore. They came, they stung, and then they passed, leaving her stronger in their wake. Maggie had not replaced her old life with a new one. That wasn't possible. Some losses carved too deeply to ever fully heal. But she had chosen to fill the spaces left behind with something that mattered. Not noise, not busy work, not empty obligations, but real, rooted joys. Small ones, everyday ones. The kind of joys that grew slowly but surely, like seedlings, breaking through the dark soil toward the light. When summer finally arrived in full force, Maggie's little garden exploded into color and scent. Bees hummed among the blossoms, birds dipped down to peck at the seeds she scattered. Every morning, she watered the plants with careful hands, whispering encouragement under her breath as if they could hear her. And maybe, in some small way, they could. Maybe the earth, too, understood what it meant to be abandoned, to be forgotten, and then to bloom again, more beautiful for the breakage. Sitting on her porch, a glass of lemonade sweating in her hand, Maggie watched the sunset paint the sky in fiery oranges and soft pinks. She felt the slow, steady beat of her heart and the warm, contented ache of muscles used well. She thought of the life she had built, not grand or loud, but entirely, gloriously her own. And she smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because she had learned at last that life's greatest beauty isn't in the grand celebrations you're invited to. It's in the quiet, everyday celebrations you create for yourself. Maggie's world had settled into a rhythm that finally felt like her own. But peace, like anything precious, is always vulnerable. One ordinary Tuesday afternoon in early June, the phone rang. Maggie recognized the number immediately. It was her daughter's. For a heartbeat, she considered letting it go to voicemail, the old fear fluttering against the walls of her chest. But she didn't. She answered, her voice steady, curious but guarded. Her daughter's voice was bright, almost too bright, the way people sound when they are balancing on the edge of guilt. She chatted for a few minutes, asking about the weather, about Maggie's health, making small talk that felt painfully out of place between them now. Then came the reason for the call. There was a family reunion being planned, a big gathering 2 states away, at a cousin's newly built vacation home. It would be a whole weekend affair, filled with cookouts, games, laughter. Her daughter wanted to know, would Maggie come? For a moment, time stood still. Maggie could almost see the version of herself who would have immediately said yes, eager to be included, desperate to feel needed again. That woman would have rearranged her plans, baked pies, packed carefully chosen gifts, spent 3 days pouring herself into making everyone else's time easier, happier, more comfortable. That woman would have leapt at the chance for a place, at the table, even if it came as an afterthought. But Maggie was no longer that woman. She sat there, the phone pressed to her ear, feeling the old ache of longing rise in her chest. But now she recognized it for what it was. Not a call to action, but a wound that needed tending, not reopening. She asked a simple question, her voice calm, without accusation. Why didn't you come for Thanksgiving? There was a silence on the other end of the line, heavy and telling. Her daughter stammered something about being busy, about how things had gotten complicated, about how everyone assumed someone else had called. Excuses, each one thinner than the last, piling up like dry leaves against a closed door. Maggie listened, and then, with a tenderness that surprised even herself, she said, I needed you then, and you weren't there. Another silence. Then, a halting apology, the kind that comes too late, stitched together more from guilt than understanding. Maggie accepted it, because forgiveness was a gift she had already decided to give, for herself, not for them. But she did not offer to rearrange her life to make room for their guilt. She told her daughter, gently but firmly, that she would not be coming to the reunion, that her days of chasing inclusion were over, that she had built a life she loved, rooted in people and places that honored her presence without demanding her sacrifice. Her daughter cried. Maggie's heart twisted, because love, real love, never stops aching even when boundaries must be drawn. But she didn't back down. She couldn't. She had fought too hard, bled too much inside, to hand her hard-won peace back to people who hadn't noticed she was hurting until her absence made them uncomfortable. After they hung up, Maggie sat quietly for a long time, staring out at her garden where the first tomatoes were starting to ripen. She let the sorrow come. She let the love stay. She let them exist side by side, because life was rarely one or the other. It was both, always both. Choosing herself hadn't erased her love for her family. It hadn't made the losses hurt any less. But it had taught her that true love, real, abiding love, asks you to be whole, not hollow. True love does not require you to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. And sitting there, the evening breeze stirring the scent of lavender and fresh earth around her, Maggie knew she had chosen rightly. She would mourn what was lost, yes. She would feel the sting of it some days more sharply than others. But she would not let that morning shrink her back into the shadow of her own life. The world was still vast and beautiful and waiting. And so was she. Summer ripened around Maggie, each day folding into the next with a kind of slow, patient beauty she had never allowed herself to notice before. Her garden thrived under her careful touch, the tomatoes swelling into fat, sun-warmed jewels, the lavender brushing against her ankles with every step. The mornings belonged to her now, long, quiet hours spent tending to the earth, sipping, strong coffee on the porch, letting the breeze rearrange the loose wisps of her silver hair. One morning, as Maggie was pruning the roses, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a hurried text message, a real, handwritten letter. She recognized her daughter's handwriting immediately, neat, careful, trying too hard to look casual. For a long moment she simply held it in her hands, feeling the weight of it. Letters, real ones, carried a different kind of energy. They took time. They thought. Maggie knew that whatever waited inside those folds of paper had been mulled over, labored through. It wasn't a passing apology squeezed between errands. It was something heavier. She opened it slowly, sitting at her kitchen table, the sunlight pooling across the surface like warm syrup. The letter was long. Her daughter wrote about her own blind spots, about how she had taken Maggie's strength for granted. She admitted, with a rawness that made Maggie's chest ache, that she had assumed Maggie would always be there, always ready, always giving, always quietly folding herself around everyone else's needs. She said she was sorry, not because she was caught, or because guilt had made her uncomfortable, but because she finally understood what she had failed to see. There were no grand promises in the letter, no sweeping gestures to fix what was broken, just an acknowledgement of the hurt and a timid hope that maybe, if Maggie was willing, they could start something new, something built on mutual respect, not silent expectation. Maggie sat there for a long time after reading the letter, the house humming around her with the sounds of a life she had built with her own 2 hands. She thought about the Thanksgiving table that had sat empty, about the dozens of other small heartbreaks that had paved the road to this moment. She thought about the years spent bending and bending until her spirit almost snapped, and she realized something simple, something breathtaking. She didn't need to decide anything today. She didn't owe anyone an immediate answer, not even her daughter. Healing was not a race. Trust, once cracked, took time to mend. Love, if it was real, would wait. Instead of rushing to call or write back, Maggie folded the letter carefully, placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her most precious things: photographs, ticket stubs, a dried corsage from her prom. She placed it there not as a promise to respond, but as an acknowledgement that it mattered, that she mattered. Days passed, sweet and slow. Maggie worked in her garden. She took a bus trip with her pottery friends to a museum 2 towns over. She bought herself a second-hand bicycle and, wobbling like a child at first, taught herself to ride again on the quiet back roads. She lived, not for anyone else, not as an audition for love. She lived for the joy of it, for the small daily miracles she had learned to treasure. It wasn't that she had closed the door forever on her family. It wasn't that she no longer cared. It was simply that she had finally learned her love was not something to be bartered or begged for. It was a gift, and it would be given, if ever again, on her terms. One evening, as the sky bruised itself into purples and golds, Maggie sat on her porch with a book open in her lap and her dog, a scruffy little mutt she had adopted from the shelter in spring, snoring gently at her feet. She sipped a cup of tea and watched the fireflies blink into existence, feeling the cool, blessed peace of a life lived authentically. The world was still flawed. People were still imperfect. Hurt still lived in the corners of her heart. But Maggie had learned the most important truth of all. She was whole already. She didn't need anyone else's permission to be loved, to be seen, to be celebrated. She carried all of that inside her now, as steady and sure as the stars slowly piercing the velvet sky above her. And if her family ever truly wanted to find her again, not the woman they once used without seeing, but the woman she had fought to become, they would have to meet her here, on ground she had claimed for herself. The days slipped easily into each other, and Maggie found herself no longer counting them by who called, who visited, who remembered. Her life no longer revolved around waiting for acknowledgement or mending broken ties. Instead, she marked her days with simpler, sweeter milestones. The first ripened tomato plucked from the vine, the way the light shifted golden through the kitchen window at dusk, the comforting weight of her scruffy dog curled at her feet each night. The letter from her daughter remained in its place among Maggie's treasures, untouched, but not forgotten. Occasionally, she would think about it, feeling the faint, tender ache of old hopes and deeper wisdom. She hadn't written back yet. She hadn't decided whether she would. And for once, that decision, or the absence of one, didn't gnaw at her. It simply was. Healing, she had realized, wasn't about racing to repair what had broken. It was about respecting the scars it left behind, letting them be part of your story without letting them define you. Word must have spread through the family, Maggie suspected, that she was different now, that she wasn't angry, but she wasn't available in the same unthinking way she used to be either. The invitations came differently, when they came at all, less frequent, more tentative, wrapped in genuine effort rather than causal assumption. Sometimes she accepted, sometimes she didn't. Always, she chose based on what nourished her rather than what others expected. And as the seasons shifted once again, Maggie noticed something extraordinary. She was no longer surviving her life. She was living it, fully, deeply, joyfully. She was no longer the backdrop to other people's happiness. She was the vivid, beating center of her own story. There were still echoes of sadness, of course. Memories didn't vanish because you chose yourself. But they softened over time, like river stones worn smooth by water. They became part of her, not weights around her neck, but markers of everything she had survived and everything she had built in the aftermath. On a soft September morning, Maggie stood barefoot in her garden, the dew cold between her toes, her dog wagging lazily beside her. She looked at the sprawling patchwork of color she had coaxed into life, every bloom a stubborn, beautiful testament to her refusal to be erased. She breathed in deeply, the scent of lavender and tomatoes heavy in the air, and smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because she had built a life that didn't need to be perfect to be enough. She had missed Thanksgiving once, but in doing so, she had found herself, and she would never be missing again. As autumn deepened and the days shortened, Maggie found herself savoring the quiet more than she ever had before. Her life, once crammed with the noise of obligations and expectations, had softened into something simpler, something truer. There was a deep steadiness to her days now, a rhythm dictated not by other people's demands, but by the rise and fall of the sun, the slow turning of the seasons, and the small, deliberate choices she made for herself. She often reflected on that Thanksgiving, the empty table, the silent phone, the crushing weight of betrayal. For a long time, those memories had burned hot against her ribs, reminders of everything she had given and everything she had lost. But now, they lived inside her differently. They had become lessons, not wounds, markers of a moment when she could have broken, but instead chose to rebuild. Maggie understood now that love, real love, must be given freely, not squeezed from silent sacrifice, not extracted from endless giving. She understood that being needed and being valued were not the same thing. And she understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to step away, to stop enabling comfort at the cost of your own soul. Her family remained part of her life, but on different terms she set with quiet clarity. She saw them when it felt right, when it brought joy, not obligation. She let go of the dream of being who they wanted her to be, and instead chose to be fully herself. On cool evenings, she sat on her porch with a book and a cup of tea, her dog nestled at her side, the scent of drying leaves curling through the air. She felt no need to chase the past, no desperate yearning for what might have been. She had chosen herself, and in doing so, had found a peace deeper than anything she had ever known. The life Maggie lived now wasn't grand or flashy. It was quiet, it was steady, and it was entirely, beautifully her own. Have you ever reached a moment when you had to choose yourself after being overlooked or forgotten? We would love to hear your story, your strength, your resilience, your quiet victories. Share your journey in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more powerful, emotional stories about dignity, healing, and the beauty of reclaiming your life. Your voice matters. Your story deserves to be heard.